There is a monster lurking in the shadows of society, one that always has been and always will be. It's patient, it's focused, and its name is Grendel. Across a 40-year career, author and illustrator Matt Wagner has blazed a trail through comics, working his way from the beginnings of the indie scene to the forefront of the mainstream. Wagner's worked on countless acclaimed stories over the years, from Batman to Etrigan to the Justice League to Zorro, but to this day, his most recognized work remains Grendel, the sprawling saga of Hunter Rose and his centuries-long legacy of evil. Starting life as a series of one-offs and backups, Grendel has grown from a grounded crime drama into something massive and ever-evolving, with Wagner bringing in countless collaborators to grow the scope, style, and format of his story, all while deepening its central themes. And while it never quite reached the mainstream popularity of other indie hits, Grendel still stands as a masterclass of what a creator can achieve inside the comic medium, with Wagner using each milestone in his career to grow and refine his story. Here I will examine the origins, expansion, and evolution of both creator and creation to explore the legacy of this gothic, brutal, genre-defying odyssey of evil. The origins of Grendel can be traced all the way back to the childhood of its creator. Born in 1961 on the outskirts of Pennsylvania Amish country to a former soldier and schoolteacher, Matt Wagner spent his early years reading anything he could get his hands on, namely Arthurian myths, Michael Moorcock's Elric saga, and John Gardner's novel about the Beowulf villain Grendel. Hey, that sounds familiar. Wagner's love of reading would eventually lead him to the medium of comics, which, in turn, inspired him to pursue a career in the arts, something that Wagner initially struggled with. I wanted to head for comics from the start, but they were such a mystery to me, the author states. And of course, in those days, it was all centered around the big two publishers. You pretty much had to live in New York. You had to show up at the offices in person to get jobs. As a result, it was very, very insular, and I just had no idea what it was all about. While it would take the author years to reach the big two, his first step into comics would come in the late 70s when, after transferring to the Philadelphia College of Art, he would meet the founders of indie publisher Comico. After winning a story spot in the black and white Comico Primer anthology in 1982, the 19-year-old Wagner would draw from his childhood inspirations, as well as his love of pulp stories, to craft a character wholly outside the safer world of superhero comics. The result was Hunter Rose, a novelist and socialite masquerading as the crime boss and assassin Grendel. Unfortunately, the character's early years were less than perfect. While Wagner's art and scripts were well received, Grendel's spot in an anthology didn't really allow for much depth, leading to some sparse appearances that Wagner later referred to as a rough draft of the story he wanted to tell. It didn't help that Comico canceled the series 3 issues in, citing financial issues. We'll come back to that later. And just to really rub salt in the wound, this was only a few years before Eastman and Laird's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles kicked off a major black and white comics boom. Just a lot of bad luck all around. However, when the publisher brought Wagner's Mage series into their New Color Comics line, the author found the opportunity to continue Grendel through a series of backups. And while the story's 4 pages per issue wasn't exactly freeing, these constraints gave Wagner his earliest experiments in style and format, combining heavy prose, anime-inspired visuals, Art Deco-styled layouts, and a palette of black, white, and red to sell the gritty, gothic tone of Hunter's story, with Mage's more heroic tone encouraging Wagner to take Grendel to a much darker place. When asked about the interplay between his two series, Wagner would reflect, "I always say that Mage is about facing up to life and growing up, whether you want to or not, and Grendel is about great aptitude that atrophies and never comes to fruition. I found it very creatively fulfilling to be able to play with both of these concepts and not get locked into one mindset, because I don't feel like I have one mindset about life. You know, I believe in heroism, in doing the right thing, but I'm also incredibly cynical when I look at the world around me and realize what most of the people in power are. Later collected as Devil by the Deed, the reimagined series is framed as a posthumous look into Grendel's life, with journalist Christine Spar piecing together the details of Hunter's bloody rise to power, his violent end, and the cycles of evil and abuse that eventually doomed everyone around him. And while the massive amounts of prose on every page can feel intimidating, not Spawn levels of text, but it's still a lot, it's amazing just how much story Wagner is able to cram into 34 pages, adding Hunter's own twisted backstory and fleshing out his relationships with his ward Stacy and his monstrous rival Argent. It's also much, much bloodier, with Wagner taking full advantage of Comico's indie label and elevating Grendel into a brutal, theatrical killer. And yet, for everything explained, there are still massive swaths of Grendel that Wagner leaves shrouded in mystery, leaving readers to stew in the experience and try to make sense of this murky, morally complex figure. Was there ever any good in Hunter Rose, or did his violent ambition only reflect a deeper corruption in the world around us? Was Grendel a singular force of evil, or was he just a product of society's failings? We may read other accounts of his life, but the real terror is, we may never know for sure. In a grim but funny case of life imitating art, Devil by the Deed ended up finally cementing Grendel's success, with Wagner's fans and publishers praising the backup's rich gothic presentation and hungering for more stories about this enigmatic anti-hero. Just like its in-fiction counterpart, Devil by the Deed became a bestseller, all but assuring the character's return. Despite the all-too-certain death of Hunter Rose, Grendel would live on. By 1986, the success of Devil by the Deed had launched Grendel into indie comics stardom, even outshining Mage by the end of its initial run. And as such, Comico were quick to respond to fan demand, encouraging Wagner to begin a new solo series immediately. There was just one major problem with this, namely that Hunter Rose was still super dead. But instead of seeing this as a limitation, Wagner used Hunter's death as an opportunity to turn Grendel into a mantle passed from person to person, with the series following its legacy as it inspires villains, heroes, fanatics, and countless others. Comico had approached me, saying, "Look, we would really like you to continue Grendel as an ongoing." And I was like, "Well, I just killed him, so that's going to be kind of hard," the author states. And when I was asked to do a monthly comic, my thought was, the only way that's going to remain interesting for the readers is if it remains interesting for me. I know how hungry I am for change in my narrative. I wanted to just keep changing things over and over again. So drawing inspiration from the things that I liked when I was young, the comic strip The Phantom by Lee Falk. In that comic strip, the Phantom was, I think, the 32nd Phantom. It was a generational character, interpreted as different versions of the same persona. So I thought, well, why does it have to be Hunter Rose? Can I come up with another version of Grendel and just continue it like that? And then it struck me, why don't I just keep doing that? Why don't I make that a major motif of the series as a whole? This move from miniseries to ongoing also brought a stable of new artists, with Wagner mostly writing and occasionally illustrating shorter arcs to showcase his own developing style. And I'll say it, given how interwoven Wagner's art was to the story in Devil by the Deed, I think there's definitely something missing from certain bits of the series, with both Devil's Legacy and God and the Devil trading in Wagner's timeless gothic stylings for 80s and 90s excess. But even with these inconsistencies, I think the variety in the series' art manages to enhance its scope, grounding each story and protagonist in their own era and perspective as the specter of Grendel seeps back into each tale. Devil's Legacy, drawn by Jacob and Arnold Pander, takes place in the near future and follows Christine Spar, the writer of Devil by the Deed, as she takes on Grendel's mantle to rescue her kidnapped son from a vampiric performance artist. Another touch of the supernatural that Wagner managed to weave into the series. And as she continues her search, Christine's increasing violence brings her to the attention of the NYPD and a now crippled Argent, obsessed with stopping the new Grendel by any means necessary. The Devil Inside, drawn by Bernie Moreau and colored by Wagner, Moreau, and Joe Matt, has stage manager Brian Lee Sung adopt the persona after suffering a lengthy mental breakdown, believing himself possessed by the spirit of Grendel. A collection of short stories, referred to as the incubation years, follows a retired NYPD captain who records and sells the untold tales of Hunter Rose, only for the icon of Grendel to infect him and society at large. God and the Devil, drawn by John K. Snyder and Jay Geldof and colored by Joe Matt, sees the rise of a new Grendel in a post-apocalyptic America controlled by the now pseudo-state of the Catholic Church. And taking place in the 26th century, Devil's Reign, drawn by Tim Sale and colored by Bernie Moreau, follows revolutionary-turned-statesman Orion Asante as he struggles to re-establish order and peace in a world torn apart by constant war. Each story has its own spin on the mythos and archetype of Grendel, with Wagner stretching the character to explore different perspectives or bigger societal critiques. But what I really like about this series is watching the interplay grow between the author and his collaborators, and how that collaboration itself influences the story. While the first 15 issues follow a kind of a formula, with the mantle hopping from person to person, that would change after a conversation between Wagner and Bernie Moreau resulted in the artist asking whether Grendel could possess multiple people at once, inspiring the author to reimagine the series with an even grander scope. I guess I have to chalk this up to the atmosphere of the 80s comics boom and the creative freedom that permeated everything, Wagner reflects. Not only did I want to learn how other creators would visually interpret what I had in mind, I also, to this day, feel a certain moral obligation to afford them this sort of freedom. I never once stopped to consider what I should or shouldn't do in regards to where Grendel ought to go, and part of it was to stretch my limits as a storyteller. That's always been my approach to my craft in general, and Grendel in particular. What can I do to push this into a realm that I hadn't considered before? Certainly, the visual element is a major factor in all comic book writing. You always want some sort of visual pizzazz to keep not only your readers, but also your artist interested. Things need to make sense, they need to have an emotional resonance, and they need to be exciting. From issue 16 on, Grendel grows from a legacy character into an avatar for the larger evils that both permeate and shape society, lending the series a new angle of existential, almost cosmic horror. Of course, despite its many changes over the years, Wagner is still able to keep the gothic vibes of classic Grendel ever present, with echoes of Hunter Rose surfacing in each story and lending a tragic horror to the legacy of the character. Christine dies in one last battle with Argent that mirrors Hunter's own death. The sheer evil of the persona starts driving people into violent madness. And even despite his own deeply held morality, Orion has to give himself over to his darker impulses to build a better world which only crumbles after he's gone. While its story begins attempting to understand the complex evil of one man, Grendel's later chapters are built on the realization that the evil which shaped Hunter Rose is lurking in all of us, waiting to rebuild the world in its own image. Grendel's revival proved incredibly successful, with the series becoming Comico's flagship series through the 80s and earning both an Eisner Nom and an Inkpot Award for Wagner and his team. But unfortunately, this success wouldn't last forever. Shortly after publishing its 40th issue, the series went on a brief hiatus that became something more indefinite. Remember when I said Comico had financial issues? Well, those came back in a major way. While the publisher had proven itself a serious contender on the indie market, its decision to distribute via the newsstand market instead of the emerging direct model all but doomed the company, increasing the number of prints per issue as well as the number of refunds for returned or unsold issues, which becomes a pretty serious problem when you're already struggling to pay your printing bills. Despite its eventual switch to the bookstore market, a slew of new titles, and even a partnership with DC Comics in 1989, which resulted in the awesome Batman Grendel crossover, Comico suspended its operations in 1990. Following this, the company was bought out by Andrew Rev, who would go on to found Terrific Production. And if you've ever heard of Terrific Production, namely their model of trying to publish cheap licensed comics while underpaying their artists, you probably know where this is going. Despite numerous claims that he wanted to relaunch the company, Rev was unable to restart any of Comico's titles, insisting later that the company's employees had taken advantage of him. Sure, Wagner would reclaim the full rights to Grendel in 1993, and immediately set about resurrecting his creation with a new publisher. After another brief hiatus, the Devil would once again have his due. Finally free of his copyright struggles with Comico, Wagner made his return to Grendel with 1993's War Child, this time published by Dark Horse Comics, another indie publisher that had gained prestige in the 80s and 90s through its licensed comics, as well as creator-owned books like Frank Miller's Sin City and Mark Badger's The Mask. It probably also helped that this publisher wasn't at risk of collapsing like a bad folding chair, giving Wagner the freedom to continue the series at his own pace without worrying about another abrupt cancellation. War Child, illustrated by Patrick McGowan and colored by Moreau, takes place 10 years after the death of Orion Asante, and follows the Emperor's son Jupiter and the cyborg warrior Grendel Prime as they travel the ruins of the world and work to rebuild Orion's empire. Set the furthest into the apocalyptic future of Wagner's saga, War Child has all the hallmarks of every other chapter of Grendel, with violence, betrayal, and obsession marking every corner of this scrap heap of a world. But interestingly, it also marks a shift in Wagner's outlook, with Prime's devotion to his allies, his desire to restore the old world, and his own struggles with faith making him the most layered take on the anti-hero since Hunter Rose. This new take on the character would be accompanied by several short stories, dubbed Grendel Tales, with Wagner stepping back as writer and giving each team the chance to add their own unfiltered vision to this richer, more complex take on the Grendel mythos. While reception to these stories was mixed overall, each does a great job of fleshing out the larger world glimpsed in War Child, and shows a variety of themes and tones that Wagner would begin to use in his own stories. Aside from the 1995 story Grendel Cycle, which acts as a full recap of the story to that point, as well as another Batman crossover in 1996, Wagner would continue to experiment with story and form through his painted series Devil's Quest, as well as Greg Rucka's prose novel Past Prime, which he provided illustrations for. While every story has its own defined plot, each leaves Prime almost exactly where he began, looking for new ways to restore what was lost, or at least to understand why the world became so broken. In a way, it's very reflective of Wagner's own evolution as a creator, moving from the adolescent cynicism of his early years to a more weathered sense of hope. And interestingly, this new perspective would bring Wagner back to the life of Hunter Rose, with the writer using the larger mythology of the series to enrich the mystery and tragedy of Grendel's origins, similar to what fellow Dark Horse alum Mike Mignola would go on to do with Hellboy years later. The anthologies Black, White, and Red White, and Black would pair Wagner with another stable of veteran artists like Duncan Fegredo, Jill Thompson, Mike Allred, Stan Sakai, and more to detail the larger world of crime that both shaped and was shaped by Hunter Rose. 1999's Devil Child, written by Diana Schultz and illustrated by Tim Sale, explores the tragic life of Stacy Palumbo, with the spirit of Grendel tormenting her in the years after Hunter's death. But it's through 2007's Behold the Devil that Wagner is able to truly bring his story full circle, revisiting Hunter's last months as he receives a grim vision of the future that awaits him and his legacy, only to see him shrug it off in an act of hubris and make all the horror of what's to come into a closed loop, a never-ending cycle of death, destruction, and rebirth, all in the name of Grendel. Over 40 years and countless stories, Grendel remains Wagner's most enduring work in comics, with the author using the character's evolution and his own shifting views on the world to reshape the title from grounded crime series to a tale of revenge, a meditation on mental illness, a reflection on societal corruption, a dystopian political thriller, and even a tale of hopeful resilience. Wagner's work on the series would cement his status as a legend in comics, earning him work for Marvel, DC, Image, and Dynamite throughout his career, as well as new indie projects like a reimagining of Dracula alongside Kelly Jones. But even as his profile continues to grow in mainstream comics, Wagner still manages to find the inspiration to add on to his saga, spinning Grendel into vast new worlds inspired by the medium he loves. Grendel's guiding aesthetic is one of constant reinvention, the author muses. I never imagined a character that I first created when I was 20 would still be a fertile canvas for me after more than 40 years. But luckily, I've been able to always branch off in new directions, not only in regards to the stories and characters, but also the storytelling methods and art styles. I need the kind of freedom and range that Grendel has provided me over the years. If the title isn't continually fresh and interesting for me, then that's not going to translate into an exciting experience for my readers. That's what I want out of the stuff I read. I want it to surprise me, and I want it to take me places that I didn't expect. At first glance, Grendel can be read as the story of evil as it takes root, evolves, spreads, and eventually destroys everything in its path. But looking at the many stories built by Wagner and his collaborators, I can't help but see something more hopeful in the saga. A meditation on ideas and their power to endure and evolve, the same way we grow and change throughout our lives. And just like the desire to do evil, to destroy, each of us carries the potential to create something of our own, forging ideas that can carry their meaning across decades, lifetimes, and beyond. In the end, it's up to us to give meaning to the symbols in our lives, and find a way to be better than the demons we see in the mirror. Happy Halloween, everyone, and thanks for checking out today's video on one of my favorite indie comics. I've been fascinated by Grendel since I picked up the Batman crossover years ago, and after discovering the Omnibus collections last year, I got really obsessed with this massive story and how Wagner used it to hone himself and his outlook over the decades. It's the kind of work that I don't think we see much of anymore, at least not outside of publishers like Dark Horse, but I'm always hopeful that the industry loosens up a little bit so readers can discover something beyond the regular superhero stuff. If you like this video, please feel free to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Every little bit helps the channel out a lot. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Carol Ann Brenneman, The Comics Cave, Dom DeFelice, and my patrons, who are helping me to grow this channel and continue doing what I love and hopefully what you love too. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a happy Halloween. Vivat Grendel.